Richard, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I understand it has been a very interesting day, full of insights about risk management and RegTech. This is the last session. This is the last session before drinks, so rest assured we have an amazing set of panelists. It's going to be very interesting, lots of insights. Before I introduce the rest of the panelists, very crucial to point out to the fact that we have a mixture of expertise. We have in-house compliance professionals that can elaborate on the challenges they face in their day-to-day work or the big issues that they actually face. But we also have two exceptional colleagues from vendors that can actually elaborate on the latest developments and how they can actually help financial institutions in delivering the best in RegTech. I'll go and introduce the panel. So we have with us today Madison Gray, who is the head of EMEA Regulatory Change Management at BNY here in London. We have Donald Gillis, who you've heard before. He's the CEO and co-founder of Passport. We have Joe Byrne, who is a privacy solutions engineer at OneTrust. And we have Samantha Brayshaw, who is Director of Finance Transformation and Program Director for IRB at Metrobank. We're going to have a series of questions. I'll take advantage of my position as chair of the panel, and I'll ask my questions first. But afterwards, we are more than welcome to submit your questions. From a logistic perspective, as you know, you need to go to your Brella app. You go down to the bottom toolbar. You click the three dots, and then it's the Q&A button, and over there you can submit your questions. As Richard elaborated before, this panel will focus on risk management and the RegTech solutions that can be applied in this sphere. So I'll start with some generic questions to the panel. I would like to ask how they feel about the contemporary key regulatory issues that firms are grappling with in today's post-COVID environment.
I think I'll jump in there. I think one of the key challenges that we've seen is change generally. We've seen such a significant amount of change. It can be industry change. We're seeing a move towards crypto assets, digital assets, huge geopolitical change. At the same time, what we're seeing is a sustained amount of regulatory change. That's probably, from a financial perspective, one of the key industry challenges. The pace, complexity, and frequency of regulatory change is extremely significant. Even just to underscore that, what we've seen in terms of regulatory alerts, I think the Thomson Reuters Cost of Compliance survey, I think it's about 65,000 regulatory alerts a year. That's so significant. The work in terms of taking those in, prioritisation, all the way through to implementation, in that landscape of such frequent business change, technology change, it's such a challenge for firms.
Yeah, and I think what I'd just like to touch on there is it's the amount of change, the rate of change, and the pace at which you need to deliver that change. Add on things such as ESG and the COVID impact, you just can't keep pace. But I think one of the things that we're also realising is that it's not just targeting the risk management functions or the reg functions. The change that we're now required to do in order to meet our own needs within our functions requires enterprise-wide commitment to make that happen. So I think where I've been doing the IRB programme, for example, this is a bank-wide initiative. It's not something that just focuses on better and more robust risk management. So it's how do you get that cohesive collaboration within the firm you're working with, and therefore how do you get the right reg solution that supports all the way through across the various functions.
Completely, and just to pick up on that point you raised, what we're also seeing is regulatory scrutiny in terms of how are our supervisors looking at our compliance frameworks, our risk management frameworks, and that's really, I think, what's necessitating RegTech, because you can't stay on top of that, particularly with SMCR and accountability regimes. It's only more relevant for executives, accountable executives in particular, to make sure that they have robust systems, controls, and frameworks to deal with these challenges.
I think the COVID landscape as well created more personal data than I think we've ever seen before. And firms have had to find a way to manage that, particularly when they bring people back into the office. And COVID, or whether you have your vaccination, would count as sensitive categories of data. So they'll need to understand how they're going to manage that, or if they can manage that when they bring people back into the office.
Madison, I'll pick up on you again. Elaborate on this question, because I think there is a lot of interest from the audience as well. Could you tell me 2 or 3 of the major key regulatory challenges that your bank is facing? You're working for one of the biggest banks in the world. Can you tell me 2 or 3 of them that in the post-COVID world you think that would be top of the agenda of an international financial institution like yours?
Yes, so in the post-COVID world, I think looking at the compliance framework, what we need to make sure is that we have the right technology to identify our evolving compliance obligations, to ensure that we track how they're evolving, how they're changing in a documented fashion. What we also need to make sure is that we can pinpoint at a point in time what regulatory obligations applied to us, what policies we had in place that attached to those obligations, and then what controls were in effect at that point in time. That's really complex to have that ecosystem of data globally, and that's accessible by multiple different users across multiple different lines of business. So that is kind of the key challenge that we're facing. What we're also seeing, though, is broadening and deepening of regulatory obligations. So previously, I think there was a perception that compliance, and this is a completely incorrect perception, but compliance was very much there with checklists. If there was a compliance issue, it was something of a naughty step. I feel that the role of compliance is evolving as well in organisations, where compliance is very much a proactive partner and supporting holistic risk management. So I think that that's a very key journey that compliance is going on right now. And I think that is, we've seen it again through enforcement activity, through multiple compliance transformations that's ongoing. So I think that evolving role of compliance and the need to automate, to transform is absolutely pivotal and probably the key challenge.
Just to touch on that, actually, it's making sure you've got the right information to support all of those controls, because I think what you're seeing is the regulatory bar is now so much higher. So when you are looking to comply, the evidence within which you need to submit to prove compliance is much higher, which in turn causes lots of downstream or upstream impacts. I think the second thing I'd then like to add is that as you go on this journey and you start to understand how compliance can work with the business, certainly from our experiences, we're seeing a lot more now how compliance is actually turning the tables to become a bit more of a profit centre, if you like, and starting to help inform more strategic decision making. So that, with the use of RegTech behind it, can really see how you can sort of flip the landscape.
Certainly, and compliance should never be a project, it should always be a programme. And in my line of work, I see this all the time, like they've put something in place to meet the regulations that were launched, and then a year or 2 years later they've fallen behind and they need a solution to manage it on an ongoing basis, and they need to shift that mindset from we've ticked that box to we're going to maintain that ongoing. And the remark you made as well about getting some value out of that, that's what comes next. Now that you've got all this data, you're managing it correctly, you're managing your risk, how can we use that to drive the business? We've spent the time and energy, let's get something back.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add a little bit of perspective from our point of view on this, I think it's a really exciting time to be a compliance, risk or financial crime professional at the moment. It feels like the first time in history where kind of software is being developed specifically for the needs of these professionals, i.e. RegTech. And that isn't necessarily something that's happened before. It's not an area of the business world that has been touched by the enterprise software revolution. I think that's changed. So for that reason, I think it's really exciting. And it was interesting hearing you both speak about the work you do within your institutions, because for me, it just feels and sounds a lot like our product development process. And it feels like the compliance profession itself is changing. And instead of being these kind of single point in time checklist kind of mindset, it is much more agile now. In the same way that you would have an agile framework to develop software, you have an agile framework to develop your compliance processes and kind of operating systems.
I think Samantha and Madison touched upon in their answers a very thorny issue, data management. Data is usually considered as wealth for financial institutions, it might be also a burden for compliance departments. So I'd like to get to the next question regarding technology innovations and how we're seeing new technology innovations over the last 12, 18 months post-COVID, and how they impact risk management. So I think this is a question for all the panel, both for our financial institutions, compliance experts, but also for our vendors.
I'm happy to kick off. I think you'll hear a lot of vendors and industry participants, I guess, speak about what I would consider to be buzzwords, things like AI, machine learning, etc. And those technologies have application and are important for, I guess, progressing the profession and the work that's done. But for me, the biggest transformation that's happening at the moment is actually the digitization of the profession itself. And again, you can think back to the revolution that platforms like Salesforce caused for sales and marketing professionals. It is now almost unthinkable as a sales leader or a marketing leader not to be familiar with those tools and not to be able to, I guess, test and iterate your ideas within those ecosystems. And I think that RegTech will be that driving force of change in the compliance profession. And for me, before we talk about kind of any specific technologies, I think that's the biggest and most exciting transformation that's happening at the moment, is just that digitization of the profession itself.
I was on a panel earlier this week, actually, where we were speaking with people from the insurance industry, and the debate came up about what you referenced, artificial intelligence and deep learning. And they were saying, well, it's tough because they feel their institutions should be able to use that data as well to drive their business, rather than just companies like Google and Facebook. But they get, I guess, more backlash, even though you'd think an insurance company is acting more in your interest than perhaps a Facebook or a Google. So there's more tools available, and more organizations want to use them. But I think the public perception is still a bit frosty, except for the established brands, which somehow seem to be all right with that. So.
Great. Please.
Just touching on your point, Donald, I completely agree. And I think the digitization of the profession is really exciting. But I think looking at it from a macro perspective, it's the benefits to the industry as well. RegTech will bring enhanced compliance, it'll bring better data, and that has market outcomes that result in improved competition, safer markets for consumers. So it really is better for everybody. And I think looking at it from the macro lens, as well as a firm-specific perspective, is really important.
Yeah, like strong compliance, strong regulatory frameworks ultimately accelerate economic activity. You can see that in the developed economies around the world. They tend to have strong regulatory frameworks and good oversight. So people view kind of compliance and regulation as this kind of burden and cost on society. It's not that. It's the opposite to that when done correctly. And I think you'll see a kind of, what's the correct way to describe it, a kind of growth in the regulated sphere, the regulated economy. I think more countries, more developing countries will kind of copy some of the initiatives that are, I guess, viewed as gold standard from different regulators around the world. And also industries that previously weren't regulated probably will become regulated. So you'll have more compliance professionals and processes that are required in new industries. Technology is a good example when you consider the debate going around the big 4 tech companies today, but also cryptocurrency is one that's maybe more relevant for some people in the room today.
If I can just add a note of caution, though, because with all of this regulatory change, we all need to accept the obligation that places on us to use that technology in the right way. So making sure that we're not taking these systems and undergoing heavy customization, so we're undermining the benefits that they offer. And then also making sure when we're going through this process of digitization and making our data more accessible, that it's the right data. Otherwise, we've just got a very efficient platform for it to feed through. And then finally, making sure the data that comes out the back of it and the intuitive insight that it gains is used appropriately, and that people understand, rather than being inundated with loads of data, can use that information to meet the compliance needs in a correct way.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think what you raised there, Sam, is a really good point about the challenges of RegTech, because I think there's a perception that it's a silver bullet. You get this tool or software and it immediately transforms the firm. That's simply not the case. You really need the infrastructure, the model, the governance to work in tandem. Otherwise, it's just a recipe for failure, simply.
And yeah, my point was this concept of self-regulation, because the technology will always move faster than the regulation, but it's your own obligation to work with it responsibly, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because when the regulations do catch up, you may need to redo everything or rewrite all of your processes because you've, I suppose, taken advantage of that period where it wasn't regulated.
I think just the final thing I would add, though, is it's great to use the systems, but don't forget we as organisations own the interpretation and how we use that. So we can't say, actually, that's what the system derived if we're calculating our risk assets or trying to understand a compliance issue. Ultimately, we still own the outputs from those systems and have to take accountability for them.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important flywheel effect to highlight as well, where kind of software companies like our own are really learning from the technical expertise that institutions and the people that work for them bring to the table, but vice versa as well. A lot of skill transfer where we can help kind of more technical kind of compliance risk or financial crime professionals understand the art of the possible with software. And I think that will serve as a foundation for kind of the breadth of what is possible under the RegTech umbrella to continue to expand. And again, for me, it comes back to that point about digitizing the profession and really being at the heart of developing those skills with our customers.
Yeah, so collaboration is key.
Another question for Donald and Joseph. We've seen the amazing work that your companies are doing out there. A common denominator was a lot of reference to artificial intelligence. I would like you both to elaborate on this. What does artificial intelligence actually mean for a compliance professional that works in this field? How will it impact its day-to-day life and work?
Well, the best example I can give is a product we have. It's called Athena, and to put it into context, we have an approach to the data discovery that finds the data. We have a team of lawyers and analysts that define the regs, and then we have an artificial intelligence solution that tells you how to apply the regs to your data. So there's a lot of data. Oh, I've got your attention anyway. There's a button here, I wake you all up. So there's a huge amount of data, and there's more regulations every day. So being able to apply that is a huge task. So if we can use artificial intelligence to get you at least a fair way along that journey, that's going to save you a lot of time and energy. So that's what we're doing. But Donald, you've probably got some. Yeah,
I'm going to be a contrarian here, and hopefully I don't turn anyone off by saying this, but Passport does not have any artificial intelligence. In my view, the stage we're at in, I guess, the development of RegTech and the problems that need to be solved, there just is not necessarily a need for it in our particular kind of problem space. So for me, this is a real bugbear. I think it's something that is communicated a lot by a lot of different vendors, and it sets false expectation. I'm not saying that this is the case here, but in our experience, it sets false expectations with the customer. And realistically, the way that I kind of try and get our team to buy into it is that what we're doing here is kind of hybrid intelligence. It's how do you augment the decision-making capacity of individuals who have experience, who have skills, who exercise judgment. Yes, you can automate kind of some of the remedial tasks, but ultimately it's about empowering them and as I say, less about kind of exciting technologies per se, but more about how do you take existing technology and apply it to well-known problems. So yeah, like a lot of the problems that we solve today in RegTech were solved in the late 90s, early 2000s by the CRM world. So you're not necessarily always breaking new ground, you're kind of applying it to a new problem space. And I think that's really important for the industry to understand, because you need to do that before you can then do the kind of more exciting and arguably more sexy stuff. So for me, that's kind of where we are in the roadmap today. And yeah, we don't do artificial intelligence.
I think that's fair comment as well. And if someone is pitching artificial intelligence to you in a meeting. Try and ascertain what exactly it is or what it means to them, because it has become a buzzword like digital transformation was a few years ago. That means a lot of things, and in some cases may mean nothing. So if that's what's on the table, do ask probing questions to get to the bottom of what they're actually pitching to you.
A question for Madison and Samantha now. We've discussed before, you're both in committees that are actually purchasing these programs from vendors. So I'd like to know, what are the main qualities, what are the main considerations when actually your banks are going out there and choosing a vendor? Can you tell me 2 or 3 of the major issues that you're looking for?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to start. We've been going through a recent vendor implementation actually for a new reporting system. I think some of the key things that you look for is a vendor who can understand the entire journey. It's great that there's some really amazing black boxes, which I'm sure if you want to coin the phrase artificial intelligence might sit, but it's making sure that you can get the right journey through from data ingestion through to any calculations, algorithms that are applied to end user. So it's that end-to-end journey, and many of the vendors that we went through a review of were good at some parts but not the end-to-end journey. I think the next thing is coming in with an expectation that we need the system because we're not perfect and we are trying to improve on what we've got. So it's being able to take the skills and the system that the vendor can offer and help us apply them to the environment within which we're operating and help us manage the change that we need to do in order to execute that. And then I think finally it's building in the controls and reconciliations, because that's where a lot of us fall down when we're trying to prove our compliance points. The more that's built in terms of the data quality checks, the report checks, evidence of compliance is really important. So they're the 3 things that I would, the end-to-end journey, helping apply that to our environment, and then making sure you've got the right checks and controls in place.
And just picking up on that point, so I think the key thing, as Donald's already mentioned, is partnership. I think any new vendor relationship, it's very key that you're partners. I think that includes configurability, ensuring that it's scalable to the firm rather than just, one-size-fits-all approach. I think lots of different financial institutions have different sizes, different natures, different complexities. They also have different risk appetites. So the ability to configure, to perhaps switch on and off certain features, depending on the business unit, is actually really advantageous. And I think the second thing is, often these vendors, it's part of a huge strategic change for an institution. And I think often we will also take steer from the vendors as to what practices they've experienced, what models they've seen that work, what they've seen that doesn't work, and that helps inform our design as well. So I think partnership is absolutely key.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that, from my perspective, is that there's a kind of structural change in the economy where previously you had these kind of very large corporations that would do everything in-house and be able to afford that. And for various reasons, downward pressure on their revenue from more competition, investor pressure to improve operating margins, therefore reduce costs. That's now shifting, where you have an economy of extreme specialization. So you can have companies like Passport and others who pop up and really focus in on a specific problem, and then essentially go to a large institution and say, hey, we've solved this problem, you can apply it within your environment, as you say. And ultimately there's efficiencies there, but it's a structural change that a lot of institutions are getting used to.
And that's where technology can play an important part, is ensuring that all of these different bespoke technologies sit within the overall architectural framework.
Yeah, when I've worked with financial institutions as well, the key thing that strikes me in the procurement process is the level of due diligence. For some clients I work with, it could be an engagement over 2 or 3 weeks. A bank is normally at least 3 months, and you'll be speaking to them at least 3 or 4 times a week, and you're pretty much all on first name terms very, very quickly. So they really, really thoroughly want to understand that you can deliver what they need to, and if there's something that's close or not quite there, they'll work with you to find a workaround or get it built into the system. But they are, from my experience, they're not so much, we'll deal with this later. They're like, we'll deal with this now as part of the procurement process.
I think now we'll ask the most difficult question, and it sounds a bit like marriage counseling. Once you've gotten into a contract with a vendor, down the road, you need to have a symbiotic relationship for many months or years. So what would be the major frustrations that the banks would have from the vendors? And then I would like to hear from the vendors themselves, what are the key challenges they have in implementing their solutions when working with a financial institution?
Good question.
No, I mean, maybe it's
You can speak freely. It's
yeah,
only
no, so
2,000 people listening.
I like the marriage counselling analogy, and it's not quite the 7-year itch, but it's not far off. I think the sexy part is the embedding of the tool and getting the system working. The challenge comes when you're live and you're trying to make sure that the tool's delivering what it needs to. And if you think about it, you've designed your systems. There's a communication that needs to go on to say, are we buying what we expected, and are we giving you as vendors the environment within which to operate effectively? And so you will go through this. You have this beautiful honeymoon period where everything's rosy. You're working together constantly. I think for me the key thing is building that sustainable relationship, and it can't just be with an individual person within that company. It needs to be with the company as a whole. So I think some of the key challenges that we've found which might turn us off vendors later down the line or not look to that vendor for the next upgrade is if that support model hasn't worked effectively, if they haven't been available when we needed the time, if the regulatory change that we needed to implement hasn't gone effectively. So it's a lifelong commitment. It is like marriage. So you need to make sure that you've got that, the regular dates and stuff like that to keep it going and ensure that that tool moves and grows.
I completely agree, and I think just picking up on one more point is consistency of offering. What we've seen in the RegTech space is such maturity and advancement in quite a short period of time, and certain vendors, what they offered in 2016 is very different in 2021. So I think it's where you're taking on a vendor's offering, understanding that in 5 years' time they will probably still offer the same thing because banks can be quite slow to change. But I think going hand in hand with that is the early sharing of the roadmap. If you are evolving, if you are planning enhancements, making sure that the banks are aware really early on what you're considering so they can help shape their processes internally to meet your evolution. And I think that continues the happy union as such.
I think the point you made about support is absolutely true. And in any sort of vendor-client relationship, there will be bumps in the road, but it's not the bumps that are the problem, it's really how you deal with them. And if you've got the right people and the right engagement, then you can maintain the relationship. But if you don't, things can go a bit array, as it were. In terms of the challenges that I experience with a client relationship, particularly on the vendor side, and I think this is fair, often organizations don't understand the level of resource they need to commit when they purchase a product. They think they'll switch it on and it will run itself, whereas often you may need one or more people internally to manage it. And if that resource isn't aligned, or there's this beautiful term I heard once in a pharmaceutical, if people are voluntold to do it on top of their day job, it may not succeed. The other challenge, particularly from the financial space, is they typically have, maybe the same for you, change freeze. So if you're running along a procurement process and if the vendor delays it, you could delay the engagement by 3 or 4 or 5 months if you've not met change freeze. So you really need to be on top of your game, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with what's been said. I guess two contributions from me. The first one is that although we build software, that's not the only thing we sell. Like ultimately, we're selling a solution to a customer, and that is the software plus the service, which I think speaks to your point. So yeah, those kind of post-initial contract signature, post-initial implementation, how you evolve the configuration, how you kind of run your quarterly reviews, how you kind of make meaningful changes off the back of that's actually part of what we're selling as well, which I feel like some software businesses don't recognize or don't want to embrace because it's more expensive. I think the second piece that I've seen go wrong in some of our engagements is when individuals on both sides of the relationship don't share the kind of why behind their taking certain decisions. So a lot of people will focus on the outcome they want, or they'll focus on the kind of how we achieve that, so the kind of process to get there. But then that will change because priorities change. Like we live in a world of constant flux. And and yeah, when people don't speak about the why, like what is fundamentally important in terms of helping you to achieve this outcome, like why are we doing this? Why are we even sitting around this table? That's when things go wrong, because that's when you don't have full context and people are making decisions without all the information, and you're just not on the same page, basically.
I think that's a really important message for the procurement process. We need to make sure before we're even reaching out that we really do understand the why, so you can get the right solution as a consequence.
Now I have a last question before we move to the Q&A, and I would ask you, all of you, to become sort of futurists. If we had the same conference, I'm sure we will, in 2025, RegTech, Global RegTech 2025, how would you see the environment there? Is it going to be fundamentally different? Do you think we're still going to face the same challenges? Do you think third-party vendors will be much more integrated into financial institutions? Some very general thoughts from all of you regarding how the future holds in the sphere of RegTech.
I don't mind starting. I think we'll see a lot more collaboration and partnership with a lot more smaller vendors rather than one big solution. I think we'll hopefully be discussing less about the quality of data and more around how we use the data, because the bar would have been raised so much higher. But I can bet your bottom dollar we'll still be having the behavioural issues, because naturally people are resistant to change, and that's not people here in the room, that's why we're here. We've got to bring everyone else on the journey. So 2025, I want to have brought people on the journey and change their behaviour so that the adoption of all of these things is so much more successful going forward. Otherwise it's going to be a really painful 4 years.
I would agree. I think it's a hugely exciting time for RegTech. I think we've seen the first wave, or perhaps at the middle of the second wave, and I think it's going to become very mainstreamed, hopefully, in 5 years' time at this conference. The compliance function will be an avid user of RegTech, and also we'll see considerable digitisation of rule books, and that'll be fully available. So I'm hoping very positive in the future.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, we've not yet seen a company created that has managed to bridge the gap between the waves, as you describe it. And I think that's the big problem with RegTech historically, is you get a turnover of vendors every kind of 4 or 5 years. So a solution will be in vogue, and then it will very much kind of either get acquired or go out of vogue. And there hasn't really been a company yet that has managed to persist and evolve and I guess lead the change across these waves. And from my perspective, I would hope that happens, and that there is a kind of a brand and a business that can be that force for change in the market, because I think if you can become that platform for compliance professionals, then there's a lot of longevity in this business. But I haven't seen it done successfully yet for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair comment. And I think from my perspective, in 5 years' time, we'll certainly see more automation, I would hope. Certainly from the technology we roll out, that it will be easier to pivot to new regulations. But what we'll start to see more of, certainly, is the community surrounding that software, and people being able to help each other rather than going to the vendor. Any properly successful platform, be it SharePoint or any of the others, has a big group of people that use it for work, either through choice or through not choice, but they help each other get the best out of it. So I think around certain platforms, there'll be, I think, stronger support from the community between now and in 5 years' time.
Yeah, maybe a small kind of fun, tangible one. Like, I would love to see certain RegTech products, not even just Passport, but certain RegTech products listed on people's CVs. I think as soon as you get to that point, then you really start to have technology being embedded within the profession. And we're probably getting to that point, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and then become the enthusiasts and the vloggers and the SMEs and these people that build a bit of their online persona and career around the product. I think that'll start to emerge as well. Yeah.
So in the last 10 minutes, I would like to get some feedback on some questions that our audience wants to ask you. So I'll start with the first question. So it's a bit thorny itself, so I think it goes to our financial institution professionals. about the common mistakes that you're doing in your risk management practice.
Common mistakes in risk management. Okay. So I think the key thing, if I'm speaking of regulatory change specifically, previously very siloed approaches has been taken in terms of reg change management. I think there was a perception that you first need to deal with taking it into the organisation, then once it's in the door, you deal with it somehow. It needs to be a complete ecosystem, and that ecosystem needs to connect to other aspects of the compliance framework. And I think that that's what we're moving to now. Data connectivity, ecosystems, because each of these events, whether it's a regulatory change, can impact a control down the line. So we need to take a very holistic view of it rather than siloed. And that's something that the industry, I think, are still trying to overcome. One of the key challenges is demonstrating return on investment through different RegTech platforms. That's probably an early challenge that the mainstreaming of RegTech is helping to overcome, but it is something that, in terms of demonstrating the value of a non-compliance miss is quite hard to quantify. So I think as the industry becomes more familiar with RegTech solutions, peers start to adopt, it is making the business case easier. But that's one of the key issues that we're facing.
And I think the thing is the collaboration, that enterprise-wide commitment to it is really, really important. But I think we need to stop being the victims and accept through the roles and the industries that we're choosing to operate in, come with this compliance tag that we need to reach. So stop fighting the bar, just keep working towards overachieving, then you can keep pace with the change.
So another question from our audience, again for the financial institution colleagues mostly, is whether you see a propensity to promote in-house solutions, or actually there is a trend towards actively going for third-party vendors. What is the latest trend in your institutions, if you can elaborate on that?
Having had an argument on that very topic this morning, I find it quite interesting, because the reasons why, especially as the tier 2 banks, that you seek the third-party input is because the vendors are the specialists. They know so much more than we do. So in that instance, I'd always look to a third-party vendor in the first instance, so I can leverage that expertise and get the right solution. However, we are in a very cost-constrained environment, so I would rather have an in-house solution than nothing. And at the moment, it's more, I think there's more appetite to bring vendors in than there is to build in-house, because you've got limited expertise, limited resources, multiple priorities, etc. So and I think the whole thing with in-house is making sure you build it to a standard that's sustainable. It doesn't become an end-user developed application with no proper support, and it's got that longevity. I think in-house is very good sometimes for point in time. I think where possible, though, I'd always look to leverage expertise elsewhere.
Can I add a comment to that? Because I think this kind of speaks back to what I was saying about companies not managing to bridge the waves as you described it. And I think it's because you don't need to kind of sell a solution in its entirety to an institution. Like, I think one of the big things that we as a business need to focus on, but also RegTech providers generally, is as you're building the company, can you disaggregate your own product and kind of make it accessible to developers in-house, such that if they want to kind of build their own solution for whatever reason, they've got kind of infrastructure components pre-existing that they can leverage. And quite a lot of RegTech vendors kind of come to market because you have to come to market with a solution that can function for a business who's not in a position to do that. But I think, yeah, if we want to be around and solve those use cases, then we need to offer that.
And just picking up on that as well, I think going hand in hand with this is the shifting role of compliance. What we're starting to see now in compliance is greater skill sets perhaps in the technology space, those with a technology background rather than a legal background, say, and I think that is bringing a new prism as well to this, where those skill sets are naturally looking out with just the build in-house model, because they know what the vendors are offering and how that can be integrated into the existing compliance programme. So I think that shift as well is resulting in a greater move towards RegTech solutions.
I think certainly in-house can be cost effective. whether that's someone's built a bespoke system or they have a fancy spreadsheet. But the conversations we always have is like you said, who's going to support it if it goes wrong or if it goes properly wrong? And also, what's it built on? I know institutions that have kept an instance of SharePoint 2010 going because that's the only tool that will support the system that was built in-house. And that's highly undesirable, especially if it's gone out of support. So I think it can get you out of a bind, but for a long-term solution, it's often not the best. But what is fun is if you're in a meeting with the people that built the solution, they'll defend it to within an inch of their life when you're trying to propose something new. And it's a very interesting political discussion to have with them, and a lively meeting, I would say. Yeah.
The next question is rather practical, and I really like it, so I'll answer it myself before opening up to the panel. So we've been asked if a financial institution wants to enhance their RegTech management processes, where do they start? So I would answer that and say that they could go outside. We have a very good pool of vendors outside, and they can start by visiting the desks outside. But on a more serious note, can you give some practical guidance when you set up a committee and you want to go for a RegTech solution? How do you start?
I can speak from personal experience. I think the starting point is what you're trying to achieve. What do you internally, what is the outcome you're trying to secure? Then what you need to do is look internally at your structure, what your three-line of defence model looks like, how you're broken up geographically into business units, and then work out, okay, who are our potential vendors? And it will be a lot of information gathering, because you may think you understand what a vendor offers, but once you start chatting with them, once they tell you about use cases and the full extent of their offering, it may be that what you initially thought you knew is quite dramatically different. So I think there are various tools, consultancies that offer quite a detailed overview of the different vendors out there, how they can be aligned to the ultimate operating model that you want based on your specific institution. So that would be the approach I'd take. Try and be really strategic about it and think long term and what vendors that are going to evolve with you and support your business.
I think just adding to that, these events are particularly useful because I identified 2 companies that if I went through a procurement process again for the specific reason I was looking for, they'd be at the forefront of my mind. However, in smaller institutions, a lot of the time you go to procurement for a recommendation. So for a lot of vendors, it's making sure procurement are aware of your offering as well as the function into which you look to provide the solution. And then I think the final thing is making sure you establish the right relationship with the key contacts within. So a couple of vendors, none here today, I've been put off because of that, the aggressive chasing. I just need to know you're there when I need you, but I might not need you now. So it's the right behavioural traits are quite important, and then events like this to make sure that you're in my virtual Rolodex, if you like.
I'd suggest to begin with, you move away from the technology and have a half-day workshop, and maybe even exclude computers and phones and try and establish what it is you're trying to achieve or what you want to get out of your regulation technology, and then start to consider the technology. Because if you approach most firms, they'll say, yes, what was the question, kind of thing. So if you decide or figure out what it is you're looking to achieve, then that's a much better starting point than looking at what's out there, I would say.
Yeah, I actually have similar advice. Like, I think in the early interactions with a vendor, just share your problem. Don't share what you think the solution is or feature list that you want or any of the other firms you're speaking with. I think if you share your problem, then a good vendor and a good sales team should be able to actually come to you with some ideas or things that you might not have considered. And I would argue that if they can't do that, then it's probably not an organization that you want to engage with meaningfully. So yeah, I see it all the time in procurement processes and inbound requests that we have where people kind of think they know what they want up front and send all these requirements. And I feel like you miss kind of some of the value assessment that you can have just by not sharing that with a vendor and actually seeing how credible they are based on what they share with you first.
So that's a really interesting point, because depending on how a company works, you have to go through the procurement process and do the requirements before they'll go to tender. So here's a really good example of where we've got to go across yet another function to make a process work effectively. And I think that's the right thing to do. But I then also say, if we've done that and we've not asked the question, have the courage to say to us, and I'm sure you guys would, what are you trying to solve for? Because I know for the vendor process I went through, I had to list the requirements first. So we can try and change our own organisations internally, but if for any reason we've not managed to before we get to you, please ask us to reconfirm what problem we're trying to solve for.
And the absolute best demonstrations or product demonstrations I've done have started with a conversation where they've said, we'd like to see how you solve these 3 problems. And then as I proceed, I get interrupted a lot when more sort of ideas come. And then sometimes the prospects are very apologetic. I'm like, no, this is great. We're having a conversation. And there's so much more value in that than just showing a standard demo or a standard approach. And at the end, everyone feels like they've got something out of it. We've learned what we need to achieve, and they've learned what's possible.
Yeah, the other thing that I don't think is acknowledged or embraced enough either is the personal kind of ambition and, I guess, in some cases, political capital that these projects can get. The other side, the person within the institution. A lot of our most successful clients have leaders who have ultimately kind of experienced career progression as a result of getting these decisions right or achieving whatever objectives they set out to achieve in the first place. And our experience as a sales team has been, how do we find out that? How do we engage with a person on the individual level and really work together to help them achieve that? Because it sounds a bit kind of cliched to say it, but that is what matters.
Great. I think we have reached the end of this panel. I would like to summarize the key takeaways that I think that were relevant from all the points made here. Point number 1 relates to data management. Data is wealth for financial institutions, but at the same time, working with a third-party vendor, it creates a lot of issues that need to be reconciled before we enter into any kind of contract. I think the second issue that was raised by the colleagues in the panel relates to automation. Automation will be a challenge for all of us compliance professionals, but it should be also considered as an opportunity to change the way we work and the way we work in a more efficient way. The third point that was raised is this symbiotic relationship. Third-party vendors are here to stay, so both parties need to understand how they should work in a more efficient way with one another. At this point, I would like you to join me into thanking our panelists. Thank you very much for this great opportunity to talk to you, and we hope in the future to be able to talk about these issues again. Thank you very much.